like again to ask everybody to please remain muted at all times and also with your camera off. And I would like to invite David Southwick, member of for Caulfield and deputy leader of the Liberal Party, and a very, very good friend of ours and a supporter, for welcoming and introducing.
Thank you very much, Vered, and it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And I think certainly from seeing our speakers that we have, we've got a really great night installed for you all. Before we start, could I ask everybody to please have their microphones on mute so we don't hear any feedback? Terrific. I think we can see all that now. So I was saying before we started to our speakers that it would be great to have everyone in person, and you know, unfortunately or fortunately, we're just getting to the point where we're able to have things back. But as Adir Shiffman, who's going to be moderating tonight, said, we wouldn't be able to have the caliber of speakers if it wasn't for these kinds of Zooms. So the one benefit, if you like, if there's been anything out of this pandemic, is the fact that we've been able to have such fantastic speakers like we have tonight with us to be able to share their expertise. Just briefly, I wanted to say that the pandemic and the lockdowns that we've all experienced has been really, really tough for all of us. And as Patrick McGorry, who has been the head at Melbourne University and part of the health service Oxygen, as he has said in the work that he's done, he's referenced not just the pandemic, but he termed the shadow pandemic, which is effectively the mental health, the follow-ons from the pandemic itself and the lockdowns that it's been caused. And there's been no question that that the sufferings of many of our children, that their classroom has been their bedroom, for many of those facing isolation, for families, really just for all of us, in terms of the anguish, the angst, the uncertainty that the pandemic and the lockdowns have caused. So I wanted to just especially thank you, Vered, and the team at Rambam and the Circle of Health for putting on forums like this tonight. It is so important for us to have these conversations and have experts with us to discuss mental health and to look at, you know, what can we do and what is the positive path forward. Because we've got to be positive, we've got to show hope, we've got to show certainty, and we've got to be able to rebuild confidence in what we do. Because we know without that, it does create a whole lot of fear and angst, anxiety, and all of the things that we're seeing each and every day. And as politicians that deal in this stuff, there is nothing more than I think we all need right now is a little bit of hope, and certainly that confidence in the way forward. So I'm certainly very supportive of this. I wanted to say also that Rambam, in terms of its research, in its partnerships with Israel, in the programming that it does with the Circle of Health in these types of programs, it is fantastic. And I wanted to also recognise Professor Mary Louise McLaws, the president of Rambam Oz, and also, if I could recognise the Deputy Chief of Mission, Mr. Ron Gerstenfeld from the Embassy, for his partnership with this, Zionism Victoria, which have also been instrumental in ensuring that this program is supported, and to all of you and the many that are on the line, especially obviously we'll be hearing from our speakers, and I won't go into the introductions because I know that Adir is going to do the introductions, but to you, Yaniv, Eyal and Mark, welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we look forward in more than just tonight's dialogue, but an ongoing relationship that we can build in how we can learn from Israel and how Israel can learn from us, and how unique partnership and friendship continue to go from strength to strength. And whatever I can do to champion that going forward, I give you my 100% commitment that I will do whatever I can to ensure that partnership continues to grow. So it's my now great pleasure to introduce to you someone that really needs no introduction. He's a great friend. He is somebody that is well respected in the medical sphere, being a doctor of medicine, but as not all doctors of medicine do, Adir decided to champion another course of innovation. So Adir Shiffman, who's going to be moderating tonight, has really been able to take startups to a new level, and I know has been recognised publicly for his work in the startup field. Catapult Sports has been one of the things that certainly is the most public. And I know in my brief term when I was in government, my first period in Parliament, it was a great opportunity to bring Adir and the team at Catapult to show them to the then Innovation Minister to look how we could being able to support the great work that they do in sports, technology and innovation, which is fantastic. Great business that's being certainly championed all across the world in the work that it does. So Adir certainly is well respected. He's a real thought leader, and that's what I would best describe Adir as. And I can't think of anyone better to be able to lead tonight's discussion. So thank you, Adir. Thank you, everybody. I won't be able to stay for the duration because I have to speak at another event, but I'll stay for as long as I can. And thank you for all of you for being involved in this wonderful, what will be a wonderful presentation tonight. Over to you, Adir.
Thank you, David. Well, that's a very nice introduction, and it's funny to talk to you in such a formal setting as the webinar, but also, congratulations again for your elevation to the deputy opposition leader role and the deputy leader of the Liberal Party. So, really fantastic and something special. So that's wonderful. And thank you for the kind intro. So tonight, firstly, I'm going to reiterate the same boring comments that we're all making, which is, unless you're me or one of our three panelists, it would be fantastic not to see or hear you. Not that you don't look fantastic and sound great, but just for tonight, it would be great. And if you do have questions, which I'm sure you'll do, because there's always a lot of questions for these Rumbum sessions, put them in the chat, because we'll try and make this an interactive session, and I'll get to as many of them as I possibly can. The questions are always fantastic. So tonight, the panel is incredible. So the Rumbum panels have consistently been of a really high caliber, and tonight they're incredible. And the panel is so good tonight that one of our panelists is going to join us a little late. That's Eyal Fruchter, because he's back. I was going to say, Eyal is going to join us a little late because the Israeli Minister of Health just turned up and wanted to have a bit of a chat with him. So
well, actually, I didn't leave yet because I didn't get the agreement.
Okay. So you go and fix the country and then come back to our webinar when you can.
Yes.
All right, fantastic. And so what we're going to talk about, and I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, and what we're going to talk about today, is the post-COVID world. I think it's fair to say, particularly in Australia, we're sick of COVID and we want to move on and get into a happier place. But unfortunately, nobody has any idea what that place is going to look like, except our panelists have some idea. The two really key issues in COVID are the respiratory side from a medical point of view and the psychiatric side of it, also from a medical point of view. They're the key burning issues. And so that is the expertise of our panelists tonight. And we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion about those two topics. I'm going to do a quick intro of the people that we have tonight. So the first person I want to introduce is Dr. Yaniv Dotan, who's the Deputy Director of the Pulmonary Institute. And I'll tell you a few things about Yaniv, and Yaniv will tell me if I got anything wrong. So he graduated with honours with an MD and then a PhD in 2015 from the Faculty of Medicine at the Technion. His specialty is internal medicine, but really, in pulmonary medicine in the field of lung disease. Did a stint at Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia in the US, and in fact has worked extensively in the US, including in the lung transplant service at St. Luke's University Health Network in Pennsylvania. So, that's an impressive bar, lung transplant. Not everyone is doing that. And his major areas, unsurprisingly, are things like interstitial lung disease, lung transplants, and pulmonary hypertension. But he also runs a post-COVID clinic at Rumbum as well. So that's super interesting. So thanks for coming along, Yaniv. Really appreciate you putting the time aside and being here.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much.
The next person we have with us is Dr. Mark Schiff. Mark is based in Melbourne. He's a sessional consultant psychiatrist with 30 years experience. He has a big focus on mood disorders and psychotherapy, amongst a whole range of other things. And I happen to know, Mark, that you are the person that is frequently sought out for second opinions in psychiatry, which I think is, that's a kind of a wonderful honor, and speaks volumes of your level of kind of sophistication and expertise. And I also have a fun fact about you, which is that you were trained in Riga in Latvia. So I bet you're the only person we've had on a Rambam webinar that has that claim to fame. So thanks for being with us, Mark, and I really look forward to speaking about some of the psychiatric and psychological issues of COVID.
Thank you very much for your introduction.
And the third person we have who had to dash off is Dr. Eyal Fruchter, who's the director of the Division of Mental Health at Rambam. And, you know, Eyal can't hear me speaking nicely about him, so you'll have to convey that to him. But he's very interesting in that he's had an extensive career in the field of mental health with the Israeli Defense Forces, and has the rank of colonel. And his last role was the head of the mental health department at the IDF Medical Corps. He just returned from a year at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where he was studying the treatment and prevention of post-traumatic stress disorder. And he also has expertise and sophistication in suicide prevention and has published over 40 articles in leading professional journals. And I was going to make the joke to him, but we'll just have to snicker on his behalf in that if psychiatry did not keep him busy enough, he also has a Master's of Health Administration to pique his interest. So Eyal will be back soon, and you know he'll also provide us with a psychological and psychiatric perspective on all of this. But you know, why don't I start, Yaniv, by asking you just to give us an update, I suppose, on what COVID currently feels like in Israel at the moment.
Okay. So COVID in Israel right now, we are after the fourth wave, or let's say in the end of the fourth wave. And, you know, it's almost 2 years now with COVID. Life has completely changed from every aspect that we can talk about. But from the medical side, I would say that COVID is like very not in focus now, because there is something like maybe 200 patients in all the country hospitalized with COVID. We have a population in Israel of around 9 million people. In the bad days, it was something like 1,000 or even a little bit higher hospitalized patients in severe condition. And right now it's very, very quiet. We also use what's called the R ratio, which is how the disease is affecting other people, and the R right now is below 1, which means that every sick person gets someone else sick in a ratio less than 1, which is very good. And I think we see the influence of the vaccinations, which is of course a very, very hot topic to talk about. But I think that's what we see now. And if I just may say, I think it's important for the listeners that I think that my position is quite unique, because I was working, I think I told you that before, I was working in the first wave of COVID in the US as an ICU physician. I saw the patients in the ICU while they are sick. And when I came back to Israel last summer, I'm working not in the ICU, but in the post-COVID. So I saw the disease from, I think, all angles. And all of them are extremely important and interesting, and I'll be happy to share what I know with you. But to your question, COVID now in Israel is very quiet.
I mean, that's fantastic to hear. And in Australia, we are all addicted to the R value. Everybody knows what the reproductive rate is. Everybody watched it, and you know, it was like the national sport, looking at the daily case numbers and the daily R number in Australia.
We measure everything you can possibly imagine to measure, you know, even the number of reports people get for not wearing masks, like everything is counted in this COVID phenomenon. I'm sure Mark has a lot of things to say about this.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
A public OCD. It's like a public OCD.
It is. Well, we'll come to the psychiatric side of things in a minute, but I thought, you know, I might ask you, Yaniv, you know, you have a post-COVID clinic. What are you seeing? You know, there's lots of talk about this long COVID. It pops up, you know, people speak about it. There's not a lot, you know, you just said we know a lot about everything, and everything is measured. But when it comes to long COVID, you hear little bits and pieces as if, you know, the image is not that sharp yet. You know, what are you seeing in post-COVID patients? And also, you know, to what extent are you seeing this in patients that have suffered from COVID? Is it, you know, what are you seeing? And is it common?
So I can tell you that we have a very busy post-COVID clinic here in Rambam. We saw something like 800 patients with post-COVID since last year. We see every week around 20 to 30 patients. And the things we see, I would say, can be divided to two big groups. The first group is the patients that were very, very sick with COVID, were hospitalized, and some of them intubated, some of them on ECMO. And in these patients, we mainly see the respiratory, the pulmonary, the lung damage that they take with them for a long time. And this can take months to maybe even years to recover, and some do not recover. We have a few patients in Israel who actually had lung transplant because of COVID. I would say this is something around 5 patients in all the country, and it's becoming more and more common because COVID.
And did they have typical characteristics? Like, was there something typical about those 5, age or comorbidities or vaccination status, etc.?
No, so most of them were not vaccinated to begin with. Okay, that's maybe from even before we had the vaccines. Second, I can't say that they were different from other people. I would say middle-aged people with regular comorbidities, hypertension, maybe hyperlipidemia, maybe obesity, mild obesity, which is probably most of the population right now. But they had such an extensive and irreversible damage in their lungs that they cannot breathe on their own. But this is, I would say, the extreme. So this is the first group, the group of the patients who suffer from a lung disease. The second group, which is much, much bigger, I would say something like, for the long run, 5 or 10% of the patients is the post-COVID or the long COVID. And this is very interesting. What we see is usually younger people. I would say most of them below 50, but younger population that suffer from combination of symptoms, including the cognitive function, what's called brain fog or confusion or loss of memory, inability to concentrate, to focus, all the executive functions that I'm sure Dr. Mark can explain about this more than me. And from the other hand, we see physical signs like, tremor in the hands or numbling in the hands or in the feet, or severe weakness, tiredness, pains in the joints. Like every single system that you can imagine can be involved. And we do not understand exactly why it happens. We are doing some research in these patients that I can share with you if that's interesting. But we see many, many patients that carry the post-viral disease for much longer than expected. We all know that if you have the flu, you would be, weak for the next week or 2, or when you get older, maybe 3 or 4. But it should go away completely. And this patient with the post-COVID, it goes on and on for months. And some of them, it's even more than a year now. We do have experience from previous coronaviruses like MERS and SARS, like 10 or 15 years ago, that some of them carried the disease much longer than expected. And we see it again here in the COVID. Mechanism is still uncovered, but that's something that we look into, but we still do not have answers about this.
And let me ask you these 2 very quick, I guess one-line follow-up questions before I want to ask Eyal a question about this. In these long COVID patients, firstly, is the long COVID related to the symptomatology they had while they were infected with COVID, or is it happening to the asymptomatic as well? And my second question is, do they still have a viral load when are they still infected when they have long COVID or not?
So the first question, the answer is no. I mean, you can have a very mild disease, not being hospitalized, just week of sickness at home and then have the post-COVID, or you can be very sick and have the post-COVID. And about the second question, these patients do not have active viral in their blood. They might have some inflammatory markers in their blood, but the virus is not active. It's like a post effect of probably most cells in the body that were suffering some inflammation and they're not back to their regular function with the post-COVID. That's what I think.
Oh, that's interesting. And, Eyal, so welcome back. That was very brief, so thank you. I mentioned when you were out that, you have this very strong background in post-traumatic stress disorder and PTSD. There are some patients that suffer quite terribly when they're sick with COVID. Are you seeing PTSD type symptoms in patients that have been very sick with COVID, or is that not a hallmark of this disease after infection?
Well, actually it is. When you look at the comorbid, and it has been already published throughout the world, you can see that the most typical comorbid, psychiatric comorbidity of the COVID is the PTSD. We have also depression and other things, but PTSD is extremely hard. You can see that staff members, personnel, medical personnel also develops a lot of PTSDs due to the COVID. And we are trying our best to prevent that and to at least make what is called post-traumatic growth from out of the big crisis. You can see that people would suffer more from PTSD if they lost a family member and they could not separate from them. So since the start of the disease, we did our best to make sure that as far as we can, the people would have, the families would have the ability to say goodbye to their relatives,
Right.
even from beneath all the masks and the things that were in the way, and it helps everybody.
So that's interesting. So you're seeing quite a bit of PTSD in the family members who are left behind that didn't have the opportunity. And so this is maybe a bit of a presumptuous question, so you'll excuse it, but like you've had a lot of experience in the IDF and with PTSD in a military environment. I mean, how does this compare to something like the type of PTSD that soldiers have when, you know, they lose someone in combat or they have that type of PTSD? How does it compare to that?
First of all, we know that man-made things cause more severe PTSD than nature disaster. And for most people here, as far as I can tell, we're talking about a nature disaster. So everybody agrees that it's a force majeure and you need to cope, like earthquakes or anything else. It's a little bit lighter than terrorist bomb.
There's nobody on this webinar, as far as I know, that thinks Bill Gates is in any way involved in COVID.
Yeah, but I'm sure that some of them think that the vaccination is.
It's not on this webinar. They're in the wrong, they came to the wrong place.
I truly hope not. So we know that we have a severe PTSD, but it's not as severe as those caused for combat. Also in combat, you have repeated victimization and repeated traumas. So it's a little bit harder to treat. Whereas here in the COVID, you get ill. If you were, you could be well and functioning, and all of a sudden you are in a deterioration and you get on an ECMO machine and all the fuss, and if you survive that, you for sure might develop PTSD, but it's an illness PTSD, so it's more focused to treat.
That's interesting. And so, I see that there are questions coming in, and thank you. I'm going to get to those. But first, Mark, I want to ask you, like, how has COVID, and you're in Melbourne, as I said. I mean, Melbourne has had the longest lockdown anywhere in the world, which is, difficult to believe for like a Western liberal democracy, but it's true. Number two is Buenos Aires. And so how has your practice changed as a result of COVID? What are you seeing now as a result of COVID that is different or that you didn't see before COVID? What does your practice look like now?
So I was, when I met my Israeli colleagues, I was telling them how humbled I was with their experience. So, obviously people worked on frontline or in what we call public hospitals. So first of all, coming from my type of practice, I'm a private practitioner, and believe it or not, now in all my practice, and initially it just coincided with my sabbatical, so I didn't start working in COVID straight away. But I know only 5 patients in my practice or a relative of the patient who had COVID. So that would be just giving you an idea. So the majority of the exposure I had is really, supporting the patients. The whole thing about, because the lockdown was forceful and the vaccination, there was a lot of trepidation and in particular it's interesting also working with, and I'm not, it's actually quite normal. I can see it in all smaller communities. It just so happens that I work with a lot of Eastern European patients, and really my work is really normalizing and dispelling some of the myths and kind of working through that. And the interesting thing I also want to mention that for some people, we talk a lot of negative stuff, with COVID, and as much as I'm obviously the overwhelming amount of people that passed away, so I'm not making a light comment here, but if we come into mental health, and also some parts of the community that some people really, they didn't mind it so much, and if anything, in particular people with agoraphobia, social anxiety and all that, they were heroes, because like before that everybody was pushing them out, and now they could stay at home and say, wow, we're doing the right thing. And
it's a great equalizer for them, right? Everyone
it
lives
was
their
equalizer
life.
for them. And also just, and that's my anecdotal experience from the communities organizing, when you had to be at home with this really hard lockdown, that a lot of new connections kind of happened. People in neighborhoods kind of creating small communities. Just talking about my colleagues, we had, psychiatrists, we have peer groups and all that, but we had a WhatsApp group of 350 psychiatrists organized within, and I wasn't organized, they were very capable colleagues who did that. And the group was so big that they had to organize an overflow group of the other psychiatrists to be involved and really to share and support each other. So I think it's great that you were mentioning the effect of PTSD for the mental health workers. So the frontline workers in public hospitals were particularly kind of affected. So that's kind of a brief comment about my
and you also touched on, you touched on this very interesting role you had, which was to provide guidance to a community that perhaps English is not their first language. Correct. Everything feels a bit tricky and foreign. And one of the questions in the chat is, a question about side effects from vaccination, etc. How did you deal with the issue of vaccine hesitancy in that particular Eastern European community when they came to you?
Yeah, look, and it's not, that there is the community also is, the Russian media was particularly, instrumental in their views. The people, they don't listen to more Western kind of stuff, and that is one. And also the people who lived, so quite a number of patients who obviously are Holocaust survivors, they were not necessarily, they carried PTSD, and that's a different, or generational PTSD really, that's their parents usually. But talking
someone
about,
comes to you and someone says, I come from a place where trusting the government isn't the greatest idea. The government here is telling me I have to get vaccinated or else I can't go into cafes or restaurants or with the workplace. What do you say to them to give them confidence to trust the governments in Western country?
That was very difficult. You were kind of trying to be the devil's advocate and talking about, well, who would benefit from that, and talking about our Western liberal system where business is everything. And I was saying, look at all these businesses shut down. These people, Australia is a very wealthy country, and obviously all the money, and that's another different thing, where in Israel, it was a very pragmatic, let's get on with it approach, where in Australia, there were some people there anecdotally who were not getting, a very great income, waitresses and all that. They actually, by sitting at home, they had a better income.
That's right.
Nothing, but they couldn't go out and use that money. So it was quite complicated. So you use an individual approach and all that. And the other thing that probably Yael would agree is that in particular people, and I see a lot of my interest being a neurologist, my interest in pain and trauma, so work-related and car accidents and all that. So that population already has a lot of
physical symptoms associated with that. So I couldn't confidently tell them, and I wouldn't be telling them it's in your head. It would be a total mistake. But a lot of people, when they had in particular the first, and they were so worried and anxious about that, and some people did it just for their children to have access to their parents, to children, to everything like that, that they had side effects, and it was also deciphering and pulling through, is it the real side effect of the COVID vaccine, or it's really the incredible anxiety and PTSD symptoms that they had from the past. So
we know that,
very tricky.
We know placebo is the most efficacious treatment known to medicine. So it makes sense that the reverse is happening in that type of circumstance. And, you know, Yaniv, I got to ask you this question because, you know, it's a topic, vaccine hesitancy has diminished considerably in Australia. I think Australia will probably get to, you know, 90% vaccination status at some point relatively soon. But, you know, Israel's kind of stalled with the vaccination. Are you seeing, do patients make it to you with side effects of vaccination, or you haven't really seen those kind of presentations?
So I would say the short answer is I see very few side effects of the vaccinations, but every one of them is making a lot of noise naturally. Now, if you look in numbers, it's a very tiny fraction, and it's like weird things, like, you know, pain here or numbness there or swallowing, or it's not something that I could put my hand besides what we know about the myocarditis, the inflammation of the heart, which is very, very, very uncommon. It happens more in young males around 20 to 30. And the fatality cases are extremely, extremely low. Like it's like some, so if you compare the danger of the disease to the danger of vaccination, I think you cannot compare it, but still it makes a lot of noise. And but as a post-COVID director clinic, I see very, very few cases that I can attribute to the vaccine. If I may say something about the PTSD, maybe a question to the psychiatrist. I think what I saw in the patients in the ICU, it's the near-death experience that usually I think drives the PTSD. And the unique situation in COVID is that you actually go to someone and you tell him that you're going to intubate and ventilate him, and he's going to be under sedation for the next couple of weeks, and that's a unique
which is very uncommon. I say for the audience, like usually when you're intubating, the patient is either not conscious,
he's unconscious,
they're virtually not conscious.
Exactly. And in COVID we have what's called happy hypoxia, like the patients are, you know, playing with their phone, but the saturation is like 75, 70, and you actually make the discussion, I'm going to intubate you. And the patient knows that the chances to come out of intubations are quite low. And that's, I think, a very significant near-death experience. And maybe that drives the PTSD in some patients. Maybe Eyal and Mark can comment about this.
Yes. I would like to add to that. This is an extremely unique situation. And the other unique situation was for the personnel, because first you had to take a lot of medical decisions, ethical decisions that are usually not taken. Usually when you intubate somebody, you know that he needs that and it's an urgent thing, and
there's no plan B. Plan B is, no plan B. You know, and cemetery.
Plan B is cemetery, yeah. And obviously, in some cases, we had family members in the same room or in the rooms next door because they were all ill at the same time. And you know, we had a wife that could see her husband being now going to the next phase, which is extremely hard. The other thing, at least in the beginning of the disease, was that we didn't know what helps. We didn't know if we are providing with the right equipment. We didn't know, and you might remember the first months we had arguments about the type of the mask and the type of, and we knew that there is no cure to that. So we put people, and for a very long time, the medical world didn't have to cope with something that is extremely out of the box and you don't know where you're getting into. So we had to send a lot of personnel, sometimes with kids and families, and of course, old parents. And you had to send them to cope with this disease. And you couldn't provide them with the same confidence you try to provide usually in taking care of patients. So it's not like, okay, you'll treat this tuberculosis a sick person, but we have antibiotics if you get it. So you get all the armory of masks and things around you, and you have treatment. Here you didn't have. And now with the vaccination, we are on a different page, which is extremely important. People are taking care of the COVID-19 patients much freely and with far less concern.
And so, Yaniv, we're just up to boosters in Australia. So Australia is I believe it's the second country globally after Israel, of course, to permit boosters amongst the entire population. And so there's no recommended time period, but ballpark 6 months is the guidance. And so, Israel's well and truly into boosters. Do you think that this is, what do you think life is going to be? Do you think it's going to be a booster and the third and that's it? Or there's another booster at number 4? Or like, what are you thinking?
First, you can never know, okay? But I assume that it's going to be once a year shot, like flu. Because we see now that the third booster actually produce antibodies that last longer than the first and the second. So I think every boost you get makes you to produce more specific and longer living antibodies. So I think eventually, I might be wrong, of course, but eventually I think it's going to be a 1-year shot with reduced immunity towards the end of the year. But what we learned in COVID is, to be very, very modest, because this virus surprises us all the time, again and again. And nobody knows if you're going to have a new variant which do not respond to the vaccine. So it's a lot of unknowns. But based on the thing we see now, I would assume it's going to be forever, 1 shot a year like flu. That's what I think.
Interesting. And so, let's talk a bit about kids, because this is a hot topic in Australia. I mean, so I speak very openly. For some reason, some people are sensitive about vaccination status. I'm the opposite. Like, I was vaccinated as early as possible, about to get a booster. Everyone I know that I care about is vaccinated, and my 15-year-old is vaccinated, and my 12-year-old is half vaccinated, because that's the timeline. But tell me what you think for kids. And your attitude towards kids being vaccinated, let's say 5-year-old kids, and how should people be thinking about that? And after we talk about the health side of it, I guess the respiratory health side, we're going to talk a little bit about the mental health side of kids as well, because that's been a big deal. But let's start with the vaccine and respiratory side. What are your thoughts on that, Yaniv?
So, I think that the vaccine for kids, I think the disease in kids is very, very mild. And I don't think that they're in any danger of getting COVID. It may be in extreme cases. And
by kids, you mean under 12-year-old kids, or 5-year-old kids, or 17-year-old kids?
Under 12. And okay. I would say in a world of only kids below 12, I don't think I would vaccinate them, to be honest. But I think the herd immunity, which, the kids, if they're not vaccinated, they pass the disease to their parents, to their grandmothers, to their teachers. So I think this might be a reason to vaccinate them, but I must tell you that I'm still on the fence regarding that.
As I think a lot of people are, because we know the great disappointment of the vaccine has been that the risk of infection is still significant. Although reduced, it's still significant. And so the argument becomes a nuanced argument, which is if you vaccinate kids, it reduces but doesn't eliminate their risk of infection, which then reduces further but doesn't eliminate the risk of infection in adults who are vaccinated.
And we know that if someone is sick in COVID, the antibodies that he produces are much more efficient than the vaccine. So biologically, I would like, I have 3 kids. The youngest is 7. I would prefer him to get sick of a mild disease and then get immune for the rest of his life or something like this. But
because you don't think that he's going to have symptoms. I mean, the trick is we need to find a way for everybody to get COVID and nobody to get sick. That would be perfect. And if we could do that, we could get our last 2 years back, because it's a pipe dream, obviously.
He's going to get, in most chances, a coryza, like runny nose, maybe sore throat, but he's probably not going to be very sick in 99% of the cases. Now, but
how do you feel about that 1%? So this is it, because when
it's not even 1%. It's much lower than 1%. I mean,
so you would feel as a parent completely relaxed with a 7-year-old who has active COVID.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a good perspective, I think.
If it's a healthy kid, of course. I mean, if the kid has comorbidity like diseases, that's
understood.
But if it's a healthy kid, I would feel 100% safe not to vaccinate him, because the disease is very mild in kids. But on the other hand, I'm a pulmonologist. I think about the population. It's not a world of only kids, so it's a big ethical question.
Yes.
I'm lucky I'm not the one to give the answers. Maybe Eyal have to give the answer. He was just talking with the Minister of Health.
Well, we know we're all giving the answers, right? Because everyone is making a decision on whether to vaccinate their children. And really what you're saying is, I want to vaccinate my kids so that they don't kill somebody else's grandmother. I mean, or grandfather, or, that is a lot of the decision making. And so, from a mental health point of view, Mark, I would be interested I'm interested in your perspective on, you've got this universe where this world, where there's been this 1.5 year focus. And again, I talk about Australia more than most places, a 1.5 year high fear, high paranoia environment of COVID. It feels like in some parts, like in Victoria, COVID was almost the apocalypse in Victoria. Like one case would shut things down, big lockdowns. I mean, how do you find the balance between protecting kids and protecting the mental health of kids?
Yeah, I think, and I absolutely, agree with Yaniv. The question about the kids is a difficult one. I think from what I'm seeing, and I'm obviously not a child psychiatrist, so I don't see kids, but I see a lot of parents, and I happen to have also quite young kids. Is that the psychological distress, in particular in certain ages of kids, is certainly overweighing. If we look at health, I always look at health as a general, it doesn't matter, the lungs, the brain, it's the body, is much greater than the tiny, absolutely minuscule amount of kids that you will get sick and get some symptoms. So certainly from that point of view, I could see parents talking about it. Of course, I see parents that are vulnerable. By definition, they quite often have illness, and even people who were not vulnerable, like people like you and I, they certainly struggled when kids that had these prolonged periods of schooling at home and all that. So I think it's certainly most of the people now, and there is a kind of, we were talking about Zoom fatigue. There certainly is COVID fatigue in Victoria, and lockdown fatigue, and certainly people would be, and we were promised that by the authorities that we're not going to go back to lockdown. And I think that uncertainty in kids, planning, we all adults, we survived that, but with kids, they planned major events, school camps and all that, the year 11, 12 who missed out on proper preparation for exams. I mean, huge. So we haven't seen all of that yet. I think because, a lot of people were in trenches in the middle of that pandemic, and the kids in particular, I think we will see all sorts of conditions. We're seeing them already. My child psychiatrist colleague told me, but we'll see more of that. And I don't think it will be something that can be eliminated by vaccinating the children. With children, I think it's a priority about normalizing their life, even though it's a different world now, but as much as the parents can. Yeah.
So let me come back to that point, but I'm going to pick up on something you said, which was pretty much about what's coming down the pipe from mental health. And, you know, Eyal, I saw that you were an author of a study that was published recently, which looked at the number of psychiatric ED visits during 2020, which diminished, which is misleading because it diminished proportionally with the number of ED visits overall. And one of the conclusions of the study was that, you know, people were scared, were fearful of COVID and going into the ED. Correct. But you finished with this ominous comment, Eyal, and I want you to tell me whether this has happened. The ominous comment at the end said that increased anxiety and delayed care may eventually lead to an increased in mental health needs. And so have you seen that?
Yeah, actually we are in the midst of the crisis in all psychiatric hospitals in Israel currently. We are extremely full, and actually we are on 120% of hospitalization rates, which means
what does that mean? There's 20% over, there's 20% more demand than capacity, basically.
Yes, and we see extremely deteriorated cases of eating disorders and a lot of new psychosis caused mostly by a very huge amount of grass and other illicit drugs usage in amounts that we haven't seen prior to the COVID.
Which you think might be self-medicating for people under pressure during this time?
Yeah, well, part of it would be self-medication. Part of that would be from staying a long time at home and being worried about what's going to be, and not knowing how to make your time more full and more fruitful. And you had a lot of time, free time. So a lot of youngsters use much more grass, much more other drugs like running lines of Ritalin or methylphenidate and other amphetamines. They smash it and they just, you know, they just like they use it like cocaine. They snuff them, and we can see that they have a lot of new psychosis due to that. And we also see rise in the curves of suicide rate in Israel, which we didn't see during 2020. It was a surprise for us because a lot of people lost their jobs and things, but they didn't come to the emergency room, and they didn't even go to psychiatrists in the regular clinics, because everybody was afraid to go to clinics because they might find people with COVID. Now that everybody is immune, or most of the people are immune, they use it much more often, and you can see this rise, and you can see people that lost track of what they should have taken, the medication they should have taken, and they go offline, and they need more drastic help. Now, this is true also for people with cardiac problems, with hypertension, with diabetes. They didn't go to the medical care as they used to before the COVID. And now we can face the results. We have to face the results, and we'll see, I guess, more and more deteriorated cases.
In our field, I see what Eyal, what you just said. We see much more advanced lung cancer. Patients are presenting in much later stages because they were waiting at home until symptoms arise, and that's usually very late. So we see also in this field a big influence of the COVID, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I've heard that kind of feedback from physicians across the board that I know, that they are seeing like later presentations, and also the consequence is causing a backlog in the earlier presentations because the capacity is constrained because there's just too many people in the system. There's a, you know, and so, you know, I kind of trying to work through the questions and incorporate them into the conversation. And Mark, one of the questions basically talks about, you know, mental health problems for people who haven't seen their families for the last couple of years, because obviously travel has been largely prohibited in Australia. And, you know, you mentioned that you work with a lot of people of an Eastern European background. Presumably they have connections back in other countries overseas. You know, I mean, is that something that has been an issue for these people over the last 2 years? How have they coped with not seeing family?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely a crucial question, and I absolutely. I mean, there were a lot of studies. I mean, these are the long-term stuff. I don't think it's so important. We're talking about increasing suicides and all that, but people who lack social connectivity and all that, and now we kind of introduce this artificial break in social connectivity is as dangerous for general health as smoking or hypertension or something like that. We certainly kind of know that. But it's really I think, and just to take up the people smoking more cannabis, there was a lot of surprising psychiatrists where only the essential shops were left open, and we as colleagues we're talking about, well, we've noticed that all the alcohol stores were open, and so certainly we haven't seen, so people are quietly drinking at home, definitely, and we haven't seen them because they were not presenting to hospital, and the domestic violence increased, I'm sure, in all the countries, but in Victoria it was particular thing being stuck. But coming back to your question, that certainly in anybody that break in social connection, in particular the contact of grandparents, because most of the kids stayed with the parents, it's more the grandparents with kids that was particularly stressful, but for a lot of grandparents, because in Eastern European culture, obviously your grandkids is everything. You came to a different country, you're not working, you don't have much other things happening, it's just your family, and you cannot see them, and you tell the grandchildren, if you come to grandma, you can infect her. So obviously that was a huge huge issue, and again maybe we'll see, talking about post-COVID, hopefully the reunions are happening with a lot of happiness, but we'll see. It's really an unknown.
And Yaniv, I'm going to ask you about 3 things, and you're going to give me your 1 or 2 sentence thoughts on how optimistic you are about them, okay? Number 1 is next generation vaccines. So this is the first generation of vaccine, and mRNA was, nice, and, been working on it for a long time, and it was nice to get a chance to use it. Seems good. Are you hopeful that there's going to be second generation vaccines that are more effective or not?
Yes, I'm optimistic. And I think the regular vaccine, protein-based, might work longer and produce more antibodies. I'm optimistic about it.
That's good. And I'll ask this question. I mean, you're not a vaccine expert, but you might have a view on it. It's like, it's past my medical sophistication to answer it. But, combining a COVID shot with a flu shot, you think it's possible, or it's, not your area either?
No, I don't think so, because the side effect from each vaccine might combine and cause synergy of side effects, and I don't think anybody's going to do that.
Well, that's an excellent answer. That's comprehensive. The second thing I'm going to ask you about is antivirals. So the UK just approved an antiviral. Pfizer looks there's a Pfizer antiviral, oral antiviral that looks very promising. They seem to be in people that are relatively early in COVID and have some effectiveness at stopping them developing severe symptoms. What are your thoughts on oral antivirals and their likely role in all of this?
As physicians, we know that most antivirals are less effective than antibiotics on bacteria in general. But some antivirals are effective. I think there are some promising results from some companies now. I even saw some studies with lower in some 90% disease severity. So I'm quite optimistic, but I think that we should, even, and it's more than 1 sentence, even the medication for flu only shortened the disease in 1 or 2 days. So it's not a big thing usually, but I'm optimistic because I think all the best researchers in the world are working on vaccinations and medications, and I think we're going to have some fruit from this, I think.
About a decade ago, there was an oral antiviral that was developed to the common cold, to rhinovirus in Australia, and there was a lot of excitement about it, etc. And the thing is, it reduced it by 2 or 3 days, and by the time it kicked in, most people were over most of the symptomatology anyway.
But take for example HIV. It changed the disease completely, and that's a virus.
Right. Absolutely.
So it does happen sometimes, I hope it's going to happen in COVID, but we didn't see it yet in the field.
And my last kind of medication question is, and I ask you this because, you know, you're at Rambam, and so we heard on a previous webinar about the optimism around a trial of mesenchymal stromal cells, professionalized mesenchymal, which, just to recap for people, are basically cells that you find in the normal body, and you take them out and you do some magic to them called professionalizing them, and you inject them in very sick people that have maybe respiratory distress. And so, you know, is there any, and last we heard they were now generalizing this trial to multiple sites, multiple hospitals throughout Israel. You know, is there still that, you know, how do you feel about that? Is that progressing? Is there anything else that is promising as well?
So I can tell you what I hear, because I'm not directly involved with this medication because I'm in the post-COVID, but I think I hear the results are very optimistic, and, you know, to get some medication approved, you have to be big data on a lot of people, but there is an optimism, but again, I'm not directly involved in this medication.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Eyal, if you were talking to government now, which you just did, so we don't have to say such a hypothetical, I'm not going to ask you specifically what you told the health minister. I will say this, if I'm going to put a toe into the politics, it's nice that the government has held together for this period of time. You know, sometimes you get some miracles in life, so that's nice. So it's good that the health minister you spoke to was also the health minister 12 weeks ago. But if you were going to advise, you know, the government on, you know, what is the thing that they should be doing post-COVID to maximally benefit people's mental health in society? It's a tough, big question to ask you. You know, what are your thoughts on that? How would you respond to that kind of question?
Oh, okay, that's a big question. I think that the most important thing is that the government would lead to normality. Now, normality means that you don't overact due to one COVID case, but that you expect that some of these cases would happen, but you take into account that most of the population is now vaccinated, and you make sure that normality is going as fast as it can, meaning that the schools should be open, meaning that the restaurants should be open, and that everybody is encouraged not to stay at home and not work and get compensation for a long time like they had done in Israel, which I think it's a positive reinforcement to not working and not going back to normality, and instead encouraging going back to normality. So if you are a business, you would be encouraged to occupy more people and to move the economy and the work on the track again. I think this is an extremely important thing, because as we know, to continue doing what you should have done, or to make sure that the continuity in life goes again, and that you have a daily routine and a weekly routine, and even to encourage vacation, so a vacational routine, these things are extremely important after these crazy 2 years.
Well, I think, you know, that's a, you know, a very, very interesting point. I mean, effectively, you know, to give you the Australian experience, we had a situation here. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a technical thing, but you'll get a feel for just how much people were encouraged not to live a normal life, other than a lockdown with curfews. So you really couldn't live a normal life. But, you know, there were people that were not working were given $750 a week, and it was tax-free. And it was if you had lost 20 hours a week of work. So technically, if you were a 40-hour-a-week worker, you could still work for 20 hours a week, earn that money and collect the rest of the money as well. But if you only worked part-time, really there was no incentive to work. And, you know, the consequence for that is an economic consequence. There's a big labor shortage at the moment. And the US has had the same thing, especially in the hospitality industry. But, you know, the idea of normalizing, I think, you know, is a very interesting one, you know, and a very good one. And so we're getting pretty close to the end. I'm going to finish off with a couple of questions. Mark, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but I'm going to ask you, if you're talking to parents and they've got stressed out kids, what's the bit of advice you're going to give them? So Victoria's, you know, the archetypal example of where that's going to happen. But, you know, more broadly, I'm a parent, I've got stressed out kids, they've just gone through COVID, they're feeling anxious. You know, how should they be thinking about that? What's your bit of advice for them?
Yeah, I think the cases, you know, could be individual. You really need to know the child. I think with kids, most of the kids are very cluey and kind of not, you know, putting cotton wool over their eyes, and you know, it's really communicating with them and just as much as you can, normalizing, but being also, you know, quite optimistic. You know, this will pass too. You know, I was, you know, looking at. I think it's also a lot of kids, a lot of parents. I mean, obviously, kids don't usually switch on the television. I think the barrage of information is also really kind of influencing both adults and kids. And I'm very hopeful. I have a particular interest in media and the influence of mental health, that you know, eventually we'll stop talking about it, because it's essentially a dinner conversation. I was looking up the Spanish flu, and the interesting thing that which is the only other big thing that we can compare, and I was quite surprised that actually you know, there was, you know, 14 to 18, and then there was still some outbreaks 1920, but pretty much after you know, 1920, it wasn't mentioned. People didn't talk about it, and I don't know if it's a denial or trauma, or they just moved on, and life was, you know, you had to deal with things. But I'm really hoping that both with kids and adults, the COVID will start. But you know, unfortunately, telling that to the media, which feeds on that, is very hard.
Well,
so I think shielding the kids a bit, and just being really thoughtful about switching on phones and what you're talking about, and you know, just but there are positives also. A lot of parents, including myself, spend much more time with their kids. That's a good thing, you know, with COVID, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I think, you know, that, you know, I mean, the media is the media, and their job is to get clicks. So, you know, you can't really hold them responsible entirely for responding to their own incentives. So, you know, I don't like it, but I've got some sympathy for it. But I think that, you know, the end of this has been a very positive message. Like, we've heard Yaniv being optimistic about the future for living with COVID and the treatments. You know, you're talking about the importance of optimism in speaking to kids, and also for one's own mental health after, you know, a year and a half of daily barrage of negativity, really, and anxiety and stress. And Eyal, you know, your core message is the sooner we get back to kind of a normalcy that lets people get on with their lives, the sooner we might start seeing the diminishing of the, you know, what's called the shadow pandemic of mental health. And, you know, I think those are all really, really positive, hopeful messages to end on. And I want to thank all three of you for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful. I think if you look at the comments, you know, people have really enjoyed this, and it's touched on a lot of topics that people love. And, you know, I'll leave you with this thought, which is, you know, one of the themes that consistently comes up with these Rambam sessions is, I guess, the importance and the opportunity of trying to find some chances to collaborate between Rambam and some Australian institutions with some of the really cutting edge work that's being done over in Israel. And I think, you know, Vera, I'm going to hand back to you, but I think that, you know, that's a nice, hopeful opportunity to think about, you know, in the coming months as well. So I'll hand over to you, Vered.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Adir Shiffman, and our wonderful speakers, Dr. Mark Schiff, Professor Eyal Fruchter, and Dr. Yaniv Dotan. It was just beautiful, and thanks for our partners as well. The Israeli Embassy in Canberra, and the Zen is in Victoria, and of course, David Southwick, Member of Parliament. And I hope to see you. Yes, Adir, we have another session coming up. And of course, I would like to thank Rambam Healthcare Campus for joining us and doing all of this and bringing us these amazing speakers and experts. So our next webinar, we're going to have Professor Mary Louise McLeod. She's our new president, honorary president. And also Dr. Eyal Fruchter will join us again, and Dr. Mark Schiff. And we're going to speak about the topic, a new division in society. We touched it a little bit today, this evening. So We're going to speak about this division in society in a COVID world. Is there a division? I think we all know the answer. So the webinar will be held on November 23rd on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Australia time and 10 a.m. Israel. And for more information and to register, please contact me, and I will add you. So again, thank you everyone again for joining, and have a good night.